Greetings and welcome back to St. Dominic's Weekly. Father Isaiah here, Father Michael over there.
We've come to the end.
The final miles of this marathon of Screwtape Letters.
It's been a marathon of sorts, hasn't it?
7 parts or something like that?
So we're going to finish, like every good marathoner knows, we're going to finish strong here as we come down the last 26 here. And then the last thing. So we'll be covering chapters 28 through 31 for those who've been following along. And if you had to kind of categorize it, and once again, just to clarify, C.S. Lewis doesn't give chapter titles. He doesn't give little sections or anything. We've just done that
that's ours.
for the sake of having this little study and kind of help you to summarize pieces. Hopefully it's been helpful for you. But in these last letters, I've summarized them as the final temptation. Very creative title, I think.
Like the final countdown?
Yeah, exactly. What's the final chapters? What are you going to say? But I think we're going to find out here in these chapters the kind of the final assault and what's the devil up to in the end. So we're talking about how the devil, very interesting, kind of weaponizes or tries to twist our basic desires, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as we might say, as our kind of country cultural kind of polis. You also have the devil trying to manipulate moments of crisis, either leading to cowardice or hatred. And then we find out about the devil's endgame. What is the one vice or situation the devil wants to tempt us toward that every other sin is leading towards? We're going to get into that.
And it's not exactly what you think it is.
Yeah, it may not be what you think it is. It's not often talked about, I think, in homilies, about how to avoid this condition. We focus more on the different some of the other deadly sins. So having said that, let's jump right into chapter 28. Chapter 28, I talk about my title for this is Weaponizing. Turns out to be my favorite verbal word here for our chapter titles, but weaponizing life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness using blessing. What I found interesting about this was Screwtape begins by chastising the young demon, Wormwood, by saying, I don't want to hear any more about the war. And he's alluded to this in the beginning, but this chapter really lays out how, and this is almost astonishing, how from the devil's perspective, the devil doesn't necessarily want death. The devil doesn't necessarily, is an agent of chaos and crisis, but he doesn't presume that crisis itself will lead to sin or to lead to vice in this way. So he says, I don't want any more letters from you. When I say he, I mean Screwtape to Wormwood. I don't want any more reports about how wonderful it is that the war is proceeding along and there's all these people dying. And then he says, if your patient, if your tempter died today, we'd lose them.
Yeah.
Right? And I thought that interesting. We often talk as if, current pandemic and strife and chaos and political disruption, we think those are the seeds of the devil. And certainly there might be evil and a spiritual battle at war, but that's not the devil's end game.
Yeah.
Crisis and conflict isn't the end game, because it says there's moments at which war or any kind of crisis, just name the crisis that you're in, actually forges heroism.
Yeah.
Forges real virtue.
Yeah.
And he says your patient is actually becoming more virtuous because he was responding to the crisis in a totally selfless way.
And the way that the enemy wants you to, wants the patient to. Therefore, we have to set up a situation or a lifetime of life cycle of actually that slow deprecation of virtue into the vice. This actually harkens back to the first letters.
That's right. Yeah. What were you thinking in that way?
Well, I'm talking about the very fact that in the letter, Screwtape says it very well. You see, it is so hard for these creatures to persevere. As in thinking about his perseverance and having that seed within themselves to continually grow in virtue day after day, whereas a life of boredom would actually allow you to just sit on your couch and let life go by.
It's interesting. We think, crisis and death and the horrors of war, or any kind of pandemic or any natural disaster, we think, from the devil, evil, we need to avoid it. And certainly those things are a loss, those are a lack. Certainly that's true. But they are perhaps not the greatest evil. And so he actually Screwtape trash talks Wormwood and his little, kind of your younger demons when he says, they, referring to that, those novice tempters, if you will.
You young guns.
You young guns tend to regard death as the primary evil and survival as the greatest good. And he laughs them off. And here I think C.S. Lewis is pointing towards those people and kind of that mentality that society, in terms of its organization, needs the greatest good to be simply survival, and that death, nothing worse can happen than death. And he's saying, from the devil's perspective, the devil laughs at that and says that's totally wrong, because the greatest evil is not death. And so in other words, the devil is not an agent of death necessarily in terms of how he wants to tempt. He says, rather, your better strategy is to have him survive the war, so keep him safe, and then lead him along a life of, moderate comfortability, blessing, middle-aged kind of bliss where he's just kind of comfortable, but there's a sense in which he seeks for all of his sense of purpose and significance in things of the earth.
Yeah.
Right? Basically, get him to forget about heaven because he makes life on earth so comfortable.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And so he says that's where we're so much better at being effective as tempters. And the devil wins more when there's kind of like general comfortability, kind of just everyone's kind of just having all their satiated in every way on a temporal level. And he says this is exactly what we want. We want to give them the house and the
picket fence and
the success and the car, and that's going to be more effective to us. Certainly, he says we get a few souls who, and this will be the next chapters, grow hard and envious or hard and hateful and things like that, or cowardice. But he says in general, we want the easy life. The easy clouds or fogs the greatest. Right?
Trials can lead to nobility.
Yes.
And that's the last thing that Screwtape learns.
Exactly. And at the end of the chapter, he even says, the idea that even from a religious perspective, and in goodness, that those that turn religion into a kind of let's bring heaven to earth rather than see our time on earth as being a kind of a testing ground or a school of virtue so that we can enter into the next life. He says trying to bring heaven is exactly opposite of the Our Father in a sense. Right. And he says that's where you want to Screwtape says this is where you want to tempt. You want to basically, he says, all of his heavenly aspiration should be to bring heaven and the blessing of heaven on earth, and to the extent that works, you're actually in a better position for him to lose his soul in the end.
Yeah.
I don't think that's how we normally think.
No, yeah, because as Screwtape would say in the text that it is the demon that would teach us that death is the end all be all of existence. But no, that's the reason why Jesus came down to heaven to tell us that there is even a greater adventure past that wall. Absolutely, and it's for the church, and we see this is why, for example, we celebrate death days, right? The death, the last day on earth, and the first moment into eternal glory of the saints is the day we honor, recognize, and champion, right? With big fanfare, not the day they were born on earth. That at some point, that in their eternal scheme of things is necessary, but certainly not sufficient, right? It's got to happen, but it's not the greatest day. And so, and this is why, especially when I pray Mass, I like to keep in mind those who will die that day. It's one of my usual kind of rhythm of intentions, because I think who is the person who on this particular day, who is going to experience this day as the most important day of their life. Like when you get up in the morning, we all are living, everyone who's on planet Earth, has a day, and some days are more important than others. In the scope of things, when I get up in the morning, I want to pray for those who are going to face this day as the most important day of their life. And you know who that is? Those who will die today. Right. It's the most important day of their life because it's going to be the ultimate decision, crisis point, if you will, so maybe just crossroads of eternal bliss and glory and happiness, or eternal regret and suffering and frustration. And you think this is the most important day of their life, I'm going to pray for them. And so death is, once again, the devil certainly is an agent of chaos, and death certainly comes through sin, and death is evil in every way, but God has transformed that in Christ Jesus so that it becomes the means by which he uses to the greatest glory, and therefore
it's the most important. It's turned into the greatest loss into the most important moment.
Right.
Put it that way of our life. And C.S. Lewis does a great job of saying, of kind of turning it on its head and have the devil say, "Keep him safe. Do not allow this person to die." And so I think if someone survives, something, and feel like, oh, God saved him. And I don't say this. It's not the necessary the pastoral and who knows, but you can think, well, maybe God saved him, or maybe not. If they
With this perspective,
if they were ready to go, if they were in grace, and and it was their time to die, that why fight that?
Yeah.
I mean, in the end of the day, it's not how long we live; it's the condition of our soul when we die that makes all the difference.
Yeah.
Right. So when
it's how we die.
Exactly, it's how we die, not how long we live, but how we die. Right. So. Some of us need a lot. I think the Lord, in His patience, allows us a little more roadway to be able to figure that out and learn those virtues. But especially when young people die, it's sad. No, there's a loss. There's no doubt, and there's no asking why. We said that last time in that last chapter about in the last session, that if we go expecting in our prayer life to yield the why, we don't know. We don't try to explain it. And certainly, the loss of someone in a young age is truly difficult and devastating, and in every way we should allow ourselves to mourn and to suffer that loss. At the same time, though, if that moment was their moment into eternal glory, at the same time,
something to rejoice in.
We should mourn for our loss and their loss of what might have been. At the same time, if it is God's will that they come into eternal glory forever, I don't think they're going to complain that they missed out on a 40, 50, even give them 100 years old if they're in eternal life because of the situation. So in some ways it's just like, it's not how long you live in it, and then so that chapter really kind of puts that on there, especially in a time and age where all this technology, and I see all this transhumanism and all these big Silicon Valley people are like looking for the fountain of youth. We need to extend life as long as possible, and I'm like, that's not bad. But as a goal, it doesn't ensure virtue. Simply living longer doesn't mean you're going to be a better person, right? Or set you up from a faith perspective to eternal life. So anyway, that was chapter 28, which leads to chapter 29, which is the devil trying to take advantage of. So this is, if the devil's going to make hay out of war, that is conflict or pandemic or whatever thing that he says, be careful, don't champion that too much. We're actually on the mode of survival if it suits our purpose to further attempt. But given that there is a war, given there is conflict, there's two extremes of how people respond to conflict and difficult situations that we should kind of pursue and see which tack we'll take.
Right. And I mean, this is where that, in terms of the plot line, the bombs are getting closer, the war is more apparent. It's kind of funny because here's Screwtape in the past few letters saying, let's not talk about the war, but the war is literally at the patient's doorstep, so we have to talk about the war.
Yep.
So that's just kind of hilarious and ironic in that way. But what we're talking about here is, how does the Great Commandment apply, especially when your enemy is at your door? So we're talking about the fear of hatred, the fear of war,
that's right,
cowardice, and all that such. And Screwtape then brings up the question: is like, how do you manipulate how the patient, who is a devoted Christian with a good girlfriend and a girlfriend that's teaching him virtue and Christianity and the depths of the mysteries, how is this patient who's a devoted Christian going to interact with the Germans, right? And there, I mean, he's trying to say like, how does he say it? That I myself, I being the patient, I need to forgive my own enemies. I can still hate someone else's.
Yeah, that's what we want us to tempt him to kind of be in that situation. Yeah, it's interesting because the devil's the Screwtape usually is very confident about how to tempt, and here in the midst of conflict, he's like, well, here are a couple options. Right? Not quite as sure what's going to work. And as you say, there's a great irony that what the devil's tried to avoid, this great conflict in a sense, is pushing the issue, is actually, he recognizes that he's kind of on unsteady ground, and we see the ultimate final collapse of temptation in this way. But he said, do we tempt him to be cowardly, or so to shrink back from responsibility, or do we tempt him to hate the opposition, to hate the Germans, to hate the other side? And he comes out, I think, more on the side of trying to employ hatred as a kind of strategy for temptation, because he says, and this is interesting kind of psychology here, where he says that when we're cowardly or we fail in our responsibility, it's hard to in some ways justify that into a virtue. He says almost every other virtue, or every other vice, every other sin, we can kind of twist it into a kind of virtue, or at least we're saying this. There's some kind of nobility here. I often think you could do the kind of a 7 deadly sins, and show how our culture has something that kind of like celebrates them kind of low key in a way, like gluttony. Right. It's like, oh well, we have hot dog eating contests where people eat hundreds of hot dogs. I guess it's fun, it's some tradition, or it's kind of the American way, but that's basically
why would you do that?
Vice being broadcast on the sports channel to great acclaim, right? He's a star, right? Or I mean, lust, obviously. You know, all the ways in which sexuality is championed as being full expression, and this and that, the other thing, nonsense like that. You know, pride. Once again, just that pride can be, you know, oh, this I'm the best, I'm the greatest. You know, when our athletes say
medals, all these things, championships.
Yeah. When someone says I am the greatest, famous Muhammad.
Okay, let's test that.
We champion that as being a good thing, right? We don't see humility necessarily serving us well in those who we put up on pedestals. So anyway, the point is that cowardice, there's no way to virtuize, and I put that in quotes, the vice of cowardice. And so the devil says, be very, very careful there. Sticky business when it comes to temptation, because the moment you realize you're not living up to your responsibility, you're going to have to turn around. You're going to have literally a conversion of heart. Now, maybe that doesn't lead you to virtue, so he has some strategies to knock us down when we're cowardly or there where we fail to face responsibility. But he says the easier way, and this is one I want to get your thoughts on, is hatred, where he says objectify the other in a way that doesn't make him capable of forgiveness.
Yeah, and the very fact that that's not, you know, I mean, we're saying that even virtue as well as vice in their own ways have to get need to get tested. One of my favorite lines of the entire letter was, Pilate was merciful until it became risky.
Yes.
You know, you have to. I mean, Pilate. You can say all you want to say about Pilate's bravery and all that such, but the moment that trial happened on that Friday morning, you know, how merciful, how brave, how all that stuff was he? Not really.
Exactly, and this is where he goes into a little bit of, like, he says the enemy, talking about God. Allows for crisis moments, because there is no virtue really without a sense of it being tested. Right? And just going back to the hatred for a moment, there's a way in which, if we see people who are coming against us as not being capable themselves of forgiveness or a sense of God's love or being made in the image and likeness of God, then we've cut ourselves off from God's grace itself, right? In cutting ourselves off from someone else, we cut ourselves off from God. Right? So I think I thought that was a really, and he says, and that's pretty easy. He says that's pretty easy to do in the midst of war, to objectify, which it seems right to me. I mean, if someone's bombing our city, I'm not going to have.
I'm not going to be their best friend either.
No, I'm not going to have forgiving thoughts if they're killing people I love, and there's that sense of that. So that seems like the road. But what you say is where he goes in terms of the cowardice angle, and says that God allows this test. You know, we need to be careful because that can turn into virtue. But like Pilate, if they're not up to the moment, and Pilate was cowardly, then look how Pilate responds. Pilate basically, in his cowardice, at least from the gospel perspective, fades away. And so he says this can lead to either a sense of kind of shame or guilt, and so we want them to stay in that place.
I mean, going back to an earlier point, I mean, that's what makes cowardice such a sticky vice to allow a patient to go down, because when a person discovers how much of a coward that he or she is, they're going to be shamed into what? To be brave.
Yeah, or at least to take the steps to say, I need something more than myself. I need someone to help. I need some kind of intervention.
I need to reach out somehow to someone.
God's grace, someone, you know, a companion, a confidant, a confessor, someone to say, hey, I know I'm going down the wrong way, help. It's like Peter. Peter walks on the water, and when he begins to sink, he says, you know, Lord, save me. He reaches out his hand, and that's all the Lord's looking for. If he had, in that moment of sinking, thought, Oh, I know.
I can do this on my own.
I can do this on my own, but then when he realizes he
Yeah.
can't do it on his own, and he gets scared when the wave is coming, if he thought, oh, well, what did I expect? I mean, people aren't supposed to walk on water. It was, hubris to think I could do it. There's no way in which I really deserve this anyway. How could Jesus want me for a follower now with this much hubris and just allow himself to sink in the waves? He actually makes the one act that we all need to make, and simply reaching out and saying, Lord, save me, right?
Yeah.
And so the point of the walking on the water wasn't necessarily about his hubris to get out of the boat or his following and God can do this through you. It's that moment of reaching out in the midst of sinking that is all important. And so the devil says we want them to keep from sinking in the first place. And if they do sink, you got to bombard them, not with physical bombs that are strafing the landscape, but with the kind of bombs of guilt and shame and regret, and then ultimately despair, which he comes back to later as kind of the final goal of the devil in that way. And so he talks about getting his imagination worked up, and this is where the fear comes in. And he's hinted at this before. He says, and this is, I think we talked about this in one of the early episodes, about how the devil loves the hypothetical.
Right.
Yeah. What if? And then our thoughts go towards the worst possible scenario, right? About, this is all going to fail in the end. Just play on that. So he says, it's not the war, but it's fear of the war. It's not death, but it's fear of death. And if you can use that from the devil's perspective in order to tempt the person just living in that fear and that angstiness and that sense of frustration or carewornness, that's where you want to be. You want to live in that space. That's the space you want to get into his head on. So, which for us, I know it's easy for us to say, it's easy for C.S. Lewis to say, but harder to do that when we know we're in that angsty, fearful, out of control kind of space, to simply say, Lord, save me, to reach up our hands and say, Lord, save me. That's what we need to do to get out of that space. That the way to overcome this very, I think almost like full court pressed kind of situation where you have crises and things like that, is to simply acknowledge that we can't live in that sense of fear. Yeah, we have the faith over fear in that way. Which leads to the second to last chapter, the penultimate chapter. Penultimate. Love that word, penultimate.
It sounds like a Jeopardy word.
It does.
Or a GRE word.
That's right. So why don't you give us the penultimate chapter here? Lead us off.
Well, we're talking about fatigue in the face of real evil.
That's right. Yeah, or weaponizing fatigue.
Yes, weaponizing fatigue. I mean, he says it right. To produce the best results from patient's fatigue, therefore, you must feed him with false hopes.
That's right.
So nesting his life with the thoughts of the next warm meal, the next going to bed in the future, all those other things. Just relying on the person's fatigue in the very fact that, again, in the plot, that the war is in front of them. Just allowing him to not go towards bravery, but rather to just go to the next moment so he can get the next 1-2 hours of sleep or whatever.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting and very, once again, like he's wont to do, very subtle and incisive look on fatigue. He says real fatigue, when people really get tired, it's it can be a two-edged sword. Either way, can go either way. Either we find the rest we need or entrust ourselves to the Lord, or it can lead to kind of just giving up. But he says what's better than simple fatigue is to let the person think that, I couldn't possibly do anything, I'm so fatigued. Whether fatigued or not, make them think that they're fatigued, therefore they can't do anything. Right. So once again, he's playing with that the mind of perception, the imagination. The devil is in the imagination, or tries to live there. The devil can't force our will. That's I think an interesting point. He doesn't exactly make that, but this inferred certainly from how Screwtape is attacking this final push for the patient, because he's coming to the end of his life. He's saying, try to just break into that world of imagination, break into that world of feelings, break into everything.
Emotion. It's a gaslighting and manipulation of somebody's emotions. This is what we talk about, where in the letter, we're talking about sentimentality versus the real. That's
right. Yeah, that's a great segue, because it's that regardless of the situation, the reality of the situation, make him think emotionally that he's in a worse case than he really is. Right. To kind of project a kind of realness to everything, which is ugly from our
Right.
perspective, and to say everything else which might be good is actually just kind of sentimentality or ethereal. I love that line towards the end. He says the horrors of war can be once again used to our advantage if we say things like war, death, poverty. These are real because of the strong emotional reaction we have to them. And once again, it's a natural reaction, and I think there'd be something inhuman if we didn't feel emotional aversion when we see, loss of life in a shocking way and things
Right.
like that. I mean, devil's not wrong about that, right?
Yeah.
That does. But the devil is trying to confuse us, or the temptation is to confuse the emotional reality of that loss, that kind of visceral, sense of fear as being the full representation of what's real.
Yeah.
As opposed to when he says peace and harmony are often ethereal, subjective. They're just kind of in your mind, right?
Yeah.
Whereas death and war, these are real, and therefore, thinking that all this evil is the real, and all this goodness is ethereal. Then what grows in your heart, and this goes back to that sense of hatred. So you can plant seeds of hatred when you can make evil seem more real than goodness, and when that evil then needs a kind of some kind of response, and you get into that kind of justified, which is really not justified, hatred to objectify the other. Now you're back into that cycle of hatred, which is what the devil's going for.
Yeah, trying to go to that place where the beauty of creation is nothing compared to seeing all this blown out buildings, or seeing entrails, or seeing on city blocks that you know and love, that you see ugliness. And so the real is, what's truly real is ugliness, but the true real of the enemy of God is rather beauty of creation.
Exactly, that's why beauty is one of the greatest tools for evangelization, because it draws us up to the Lord, and to the source of all creation and all beauty. It makes me think, he doesn't mention this here, but C.S. Lewis in other points talks about aesthetics.
Oh, right.
And that idea that goodness is hard to connect with at an imaginative level sometimes, even though he says goodness is very much more creative, and evil is kind of boring, banal. But when we talk about the imagination, evil can seem so cool, or kind of sexy, or kind of inviting, or attractive. There's it has this illusion. And he points this out when Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, I'm thinking of here, he comments to J.R.R. in one of his Inkling buddies, that he thinks that his, now this might be their own little thing, but he makes a deeper point about it, that he thinks that his characters, the baddies in the Lord of the Rings, so the orcs
and the Uruk-hai and all that stuff.
All the humble dingles, they're drawn more kind of vividly and starkly. And even in the movies, if you've seen the movies, it's kind of like those. I mean, they're not beautiful, but they're ugly and dark and gross. But they're more. They kind of I don't know. You kind of they're more concrete in a way, right? And they're ooh, that's gross, and that's and then Rivendell or wherever that where they go, where it's all light. It's kind of light and ethereal, kind of almost like you're not even really on Earth. You're kind of in a whole different realm, and so he says it's really hard to evil has, and he attributes this to kind of fallen human nature, that even though we recognize ugly is ugly, we end up kind of glorifying ugliness.
Right.
And we're drawn to the darkness in some ways. And kind of like film noir and dark and gritty. And somehow it's good, because good stories usually involve conflict and things like that. And the darker you can make them, somehow there's a baseness of it that is attractive to us. And he says how hard it is to make goodness concrete.
Right.
How good it is to make virtue look something more than sentimental or ethereal or lighter. It doesn't have the density or the concreteness of reality. And that's just an interesting aesthetical kind of analysis that he does, and he kind of touches on it towards the end of this letter. And I thought that was very interesting, because it just even in things that I know I'm that in terms of reading or watching or kind of recreationally engaged in, it's kind of like, okay, is the goodness that I want to be, how well is that drawn, and how hard it is to draw goodness in that way, right? It's easier to be drawn into the anti-hero a little bit, right?
Yeah. I mean, not too long ago there was a series on a streaming service where it was a very popular series, but it was clearly about an anti-hero doing very bad things.
Yeah.
But it was incredibly popular. It was on the top 10 list for this streaming service
Wow.
for a number of months.
Yeah.
So it's just, and again, it goes to that of.
Do I have to guess what it is?
If you want.
I don't know.
I'm trying to be. I'm trying to dissuade from people to watch it.
Oh, okay. Well,
because
we'll
it is
promote
about
it,
anti-hero.
Okay. We won't promote it, but yeah. But no, I mean, that sounds like 8 out of the top 10, I'm sure.
Right.
All right.
Yeah.
So that's some kind of thing that's glorifying that in that way. And so, but it's hard to. C.S. Lewis is pointing out the challenge of that and saying that the overall, I mean, he's not making points about books or something, but he's just basically saying in general, there can be a temptation present in thinking that what's real, the real world, when he says, oh, this is real world, is, how to put it, is somehow ugly, distorted, twisted, dark, and that's that's cool, right?
Yeah.
Well, someone asked me once, we were having a discussion about things, they said, like, the whole, James Dean, like Rebel Without a Cause.
Right.
It's like that became a kind of, that was like, in culture, that was cool. So it's kind of like this rebel attitude is just kind of like cool, right? And he says, do you think coolness would exist if there wasn't evil, or is coolness a kind of twisted kind of cultural phenomena that's born of kind of our fallen humanness? If we were in heaven, will there be coolness? I don't know. I just thought it was an interesting question. It'll be definitely different. It'll be related. If there's any coolness, it's going to have.
Well, coolness implies that there's an in crowd and out crowd. But in heaven, everybody's in the in crowd.
I guess
so
that's true.
There's no such thing as cool.
Are there cool people? Or I guess your coolness will be. It might be I think it's more about perspective, how we see things. I mean, coolness about what we regard as being somehow attractive in that way.
Yeah.
And I think the attractiveness will be things like, for instance, this is totally off topic, but now you've got me thinking, the wounds of Christ.
Because this never happened.
Yeah, no, it never happens. The wounds of Christ. Like, everyone in heaven will have a wound or some kind of mark of love through which we've suffered on earth. And so with Christ, it's virtually the 5 wounds, because he shows in the Gospels, we know this. Yeah. He shows the wounds, and guess what? That's a resurrected body. So that wasn't just for that moment of St. Thomas, come touch my side. For all eternity, that's Christ, the glorified Christ will be the crucified Christ, glorified. Yeah. Right? So those wounds we're going to see Christ in the wounds, and that's how we're frankly going to recognize him through those wounds, if they've been not just marks of suffering and death, but marks of glory and transformation. And so we all have wounds, and the question is, how will they be transformed? And I think coolness might have to do with the state of our glorified wounds. What do you think that, Birth Theory?
I just like the phrase.
So anyway, let's soldier on. We come to the last chapter 31.
Do we have
Victory.
to?
Yeah.
I mean, just we've been working about this so long. Wow.
I know, this is it. The big finish. We're finished strong. We're in 26 Mile. Talk to me about the very title of it. So he does have, excuse me, doesn't have titles, but he does have Screwtape Address. Wormwood, and this kind of how he begins the chapter is very revelatory. What does he say? Usually says
my dear Wormwood.
Yeah, he says my dear Wormwood. Here he says
my very dear Wormwood, my poppet, my pixney.
Yeah. And then
what's a pixney?
It's a good question. Is it a particular kind of pig?
I guess so.
I don't know.
Well, considering what he talks about in the letter, it means probably a piece of food.
Yeah, exactly. Here's where the worm has turned a bit. Yeah. And we see evil at the end.
The worm has turned into a fish.
Yeah, so here we see the last gasp of the devil was towards despair. Yes. Right. So the final at the end of the day, and certainly this is foundational. If you've heard me say it before, I'll say it again. At the end of the day, the devil wants us to give up. So pride, lust, envy, greed, vanity, all those deadly sins, ultimately they can't survive. Like we at some point in our life, and even if that's the last moment of our death, we can cling to those things, but in the moment of our facing judgment and God's question, how did you love me, or how have you loved me, that's going to be the illusion will be pulled back, the curtain will be pulled back, and at the end of the day, the devil wants us to despair. So we're all sinking like Peter in some way or another. Yeah. The question is, do we throw out our hand and say, Lord, save me, or do we grasp it tight in, or try to dog paddle or float,
Yeah.
despite the gravity of our sins. And so there's a final push there, and yet he fails because spoiler alert. I don't know if you've been this long, we're far beyond spoilers at this point, but the patient dies.
Right.
And the bombing happens. He dies in the bombing, but he dies in a heroic way, trying to be faithful to his responsibility. Not necessarily in a glorious, heroic way. Lewis doesn't.
It doesn't get into details.
He doesn't get
like
into detail how he dies, or he's saving someone, or doing this, but just kind of he's doing what he's called to do, whatever the little township in the countryside had called him to do. He was just faithfully doing his duty, and then the end comes.
Yeah. And
I think for me, this chapter, two things. The one is he paints and this is where we're talking about the last chapter, the imagination of where the devil wants to live to tempt us. He gives the kind of contrary. The devil is upset, and he pulls out the imagination of what the end of our life will look like,
right.
That final moment of death. And of course, Screwtape is very upset about it, but if we transpose it, we can see how beautiful that idea might be. He likens it to extracting a tooth.
Right.
And he says, the dentist gets in there and he grinds and he twists, and there's pain and there's angst, and there's, not quite sure, am I ever going to be free of this? This moment seems to last forever, because moments of pain or last forever. He calls upon the person. And then he says, in that moment when there's the release of the tooth and there's a total kind of washing over the person of relief.
Yes.
He says that's the moment he kind of comes to this kind of this kind of like fine point and then release. And then there's the moment in which the patient sees the afterlife. He sees those patrons, those saints who've come to gather him home, and there's a kind of awareness there.
Yeah.
But what do you think about the awareness?
I thought it was absolutely beautiful. That one line of, "It was you after all," or "It was you all along."
Yes. No, he has this idea that when we see people, when we go to that road, and we come through death to the judgment, and then that step of kind of availing ourselves for those for whom we are holding up, say, "Lord, save me." Those who accept the Lord's salvation and take that in and allow ourselves to be led by the Lord, we're going to encounter people, and we're going to not say, "Who are you?" but say, "Oh, it was you all along." Right? So it's like, God willing, I'll see St. Michael and I won't not know him, but I'll be like, "Oh, that's you. You were there at this moment or that moment." And all of a sudden, you'll see where those moments where you think you were alone or on your own, and it's like you had an army of angels and prayers from people, either your patrons or those on earth who have made God's blessing possible for you in this life. And so it'll be like coming out of a kind of a dark room into the light, and you kind of blink, and you kind of orient yourself, and all of a sudden you're like, wow. Yeah.
Right. Well, it's like going to that surprise party, and the lights go on, and then you see all these people whom you love and you didn't know you loved, but you actually do, and all these people from your past and present that are dear to you. You know? But what I love about that nuance too is that there's kind of this kind of connaturality of knowing the communion of saints and recognizing Mary and Jesus in that life that you have now, and just kind of making that connection. It's like, in my past, it was all these people working towards my salvation and towards my holiness this entire time.
And it's not just you and God. He gets the encounter with God at the end, but it's all the people that have been part of our lives. Either have gone before us or are still kind of behind us. And he calls this moment a kind of a meeting of woke memories. Yeah, I just thought that was really
incredible phrase.
Talking about kind of capturing the imagination and beautiful writing. So that first moment of coming into glory is a kind of moment of meeting, of greeting others, community. And it's a kind of a awakened memory. So it's like getting up in the morning and suddenly all that, kind of the flood of kind of that state right between your kind of like getting up and then like fully awake. There's that kind of like very creative, even folks in science talk about it. There's a real elasticity of our mind in that 30 minutes of waking up, which is why I say don't go for your phone first thing or get too concrete early in the morning. It's a good time for like little prayer or a little sense of meditation or contemplation, because you're just kind of getting up. But your mind itself is kind of putting things together and finding this kind of like activation mode that's very creative and supple and potent in that way. And I wonder if that moments heaven aren't kind of like that. Those first moments, kind of like when you wake up, that first stage of it is going to be like the full body, soul, and spirit kind of analogate of when we wake up in our brain.
Yeah.
Right? He really paints this beautiful picture. If you just read those last paragraphs, they're really a really good kind of thought exercise of like, oh, what will my death like? What will it feel like? But just emotionally, you know, what is that? It does a good job of talking about that sense of recognition, kind of waking up in that way. So I thought that was good.
And we can't help but talk about how the pain that Wormwood was described as feeling as well, of him getting basically sloughed off like a wet blanket or something.
Yeah.
You know, it's like all these temptations and all these trials that we were put through our life is as nothing compared to the beauty that awaits us.
Yeah, exactly. And this leads to that other point, exactly in terms of segue to the unmasking of evil here, and then the impotence of temptation and the evil one, because in the end it consumes itself. You've got both Wormwood and Screwtape saying on the one hand they wouldn't want to come into the enemy's presence. They're too proud. They're sort of too full of themselves and selfish, but they're jealous of this patient, as I say, this animal, right? This kind of lower life form that rejoices in that. So they're both too proud to join, but they're jealous not to be able to.
Right.
And all that does is lead to consume themselves, right? And so it's a sense of like they're miserable and they just want company, and not being able to be in company which they recognize is delightful for the person going into it. Then they begin to kind of literally eat themselves. Right. Right. So that final line, do you remember that final line? How he signs off?
Your increasingly ravenous uncle.
Yeah, exactly. It's just kind of like delicious.
Yeah. And then here's Screwtape basically admitting that he's a cannibal. I hope that I receive a little bite of you, if not your entire thing.
That's right. Yeah, he says, he goes, don't mistake this relationship that I've been mentoring you. Yeah. At the end of the day, if you fail, I'm eating you up. Yeah. And once kind of obviously imaginative and so forth, but it really kind of, that phrase, evil consumes itself, right? It really kind of turns in on itself, is in the story kind of brought at the very last to its kind of final punctuation. Yeah, right? It's kind of the exclamation point of the fine point on it. So there we go. That final temptation is towards despair. It's the Peter, if he didn't reach his hand up, Lord save me, right? Consumed by guilt, frustration, anxiety, a sense of false humility or cowardice. And here we see, at least in the story, the patient is faithful to his responsibilities. He dies, and in that moment of death is able to see reality, right? The capital R reality, right? And then those woke memories that are the first stage of heaven. And even just as a little postlude here to note, one of the next books that C.S. Lewis writes is called The Great Divorce, which is a great book. Incredible. Yeah. Are we setting up another study? I don't know. We'll see. We'll have to talk about that. We have to talk about that. Let's talk about it. Put in your comments below. Yeah. It's a journey from hell to basically purgatory, and then ultimately, if the bus will keep going, but mostly returns. And here he even mentions that for some who encounter God, it will be painful, but they will embrace the pain fully. Yeah. Right? They'll know. So it's like, once again, to go back to the tooth extraction. So you take out a tooth, and sometimes there's a little decay, or there's nerve damage, or there's more that needs to be done simply than extracting the offending tooth. There needs to be some kind of medicinal healing and repair that goes on there. But he says, just like the patient who has, some kind of tooth decay, they embrace that as like, I want full dental health. Yeah. So too, the patient, were he to need more sense of letting go and of charity to fill his heart and let go of any darkness or sin that was in his life, he'll embrace what he needs to do in order to come into the fullness of life. He won't be repelled by that. I thought that was very interesting. Yeah, absolutely incredible. Yeah, so that's his little purgatorial nod there at the very end. So I hope you've certainly enjoyed our deep dive. It was 7. It turned out to be 7. I know at some point it was 7 days of the week. So we've come last to this Sabaoth, the Saturday, the Sabbath rest here, and it's a good point to rest in this thing. I hope you learned over the course of these weeks a little food for thought, if you will, in terms of how the devil tries to tempt us, how he tries to work in our lives by both subverting the good and hiding the evil. Right. Yeah. So that's kind of his general strategy. Do you have any other big takeaways from the book? yourself.
Just about how subtle
Yeah.
evil can be. I mean, it's so easy and so sexy to talk about, the devil in the black suit or the red wings or the horns and all that such. But the true genius of evil, if you want to call it that, is how subtle evil can work in our lives, and how, especially pride, especially despair, how those can work and massage into in a way, like, possibly corrupt us if we allow it to.
Yeah. Think of the Paul Simon line in Rhythm of the Saints. Totally out of this is out of left field. Says
It is.
Yeah, Paul Simon's got good lyrics. If I have a weakness, don't let them blind me now.
Wow.
So there's a way in which the devil wants to keep us blind to our weaknesses, because for whatever reason we don't want a family who wants to make sure we see some weaknesses, but that's where temptation and our own sense of failure lives, not in that we're weak or we fail, but that we're blind to it, or we don't admit it, or we don't acknowledge it, or we're not working towards it. And evil's like, yeah, you're doing it's evil is the exaggeration of encouragement, where everything you do is good simply because you did it, or on the other hand, you're a terrible failure, and so wallow in that. So there's kind of the two sides of temptation, both, as you mentioned, the hidden side, how subtle it can be, and on the other side, it's a kind of exaggeration to aggrandizement of like, oh, I'm the best. No one could possibly be better than me in that way. So I just say, and even using good. I think one of the takeaways I that really resonated with me over this past month or so that we've done this is how even the good we do can be the source of temptation for something. And it's just like, oh boy, and in some ways it does come point out. I mean, that's what it says, that humans find it hard to persevere. Like, I can be loving in this moment if I need to be. I can give myself there. But then it's like, yeah, you got to keep doing it and doing it and doing it.
Yeah.
Oh boy, can I just have a little time for my own?
And that's why we
So
have
much
the sacrament confession.
Can I just think about myself for once? No, it's hard. It's hard to always be. We want our. Even though we say, "Thy will be done," it's the gravity is towards my will be done.
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
And so, to the extent that the devil can use the moments where we say, "Thy will be done," and we mean it and we do it. And even the devil can use those moments.
Yeah.
You're like, oh man.
Yeah.
Then my altruism into being more prideful, or turn it into kind of a gaining credit kind of thing. Yeah, just all about me. So I turn it into some moment of selfishness. So to me, that was one of the biggest takeaways, that there's the hidden side, as you mentioned, but then even goodness itself can be twisted. That's something in terms of our own spiritual daily examination. I not only think, okay, where did I miss the mark? Where did I do well? But then where did I do well and not say thank you for that, right? Because I know it's not for me.
And I thought it was all about me.
Yeah, or even if I know that it's not all for me, at least that's the way I act, or the way I comport myself, or allow myself to act towards others, right? Because it's all about, let's see, I think it's all about action. The devil can live in the imagination and the emotions and the feelings, but ultimately we have control over.
Yeah, it's our will that we have control over as well.
Absolutely. So
thank
here
you
we are.
for
This is
7
it.
parts.
Yeah,
the 7 parts. I don't know what to do from here.
Yeah, exactly.
But thanks for joining us.
We'll have to take a deep breath and then see what we want to do. So and if you have any suggestions from our faithful viewing or listening audience, this book study was of interest. There are lots more to do that, or maybe we'll do just a little bit of we can step back and maybe do kind of our usual kind of thing about commenting on the saints, or doing our we could bring back trivia. Our trivia.
Ask a priest, whatever.
Ask a priest, whatever it is. Drop your suggestions in the notes for sure, and may all that we do truly radiate the joy of the gospel here in the heart of this